I thought I had the perfect marriage, until a single discovery unraveled everything. What I found out about my wife, her secrets, and the people I trusted would change my life forever. Timothy Burns, Tim to his friends, glanced at his phone after leaving a voicemail for his wife, Candace. Or Candy, as she liked to be called. They'd been married for 5 years, and he'd just landed a major service contract with a large California-based company that had offices nationwide. His boss, Jake Hudson, was sure to be thrilled. This contract was a game-changer, not just for their IT firm's growth but for Tim's career too. The pay raise it brought might finally make it possible for him and Candy to start the family they'd been dreaming of for so long. But even as Tim let himself feel a small sense of accomplishment, a gnawing worry tugged at the back of his mind. It had been there ever since he'd returned from a camping trip with Jake a little over a week ago. Candy had seemed different. Distracted, like her mind was elsewhere most of the time. She'd also been more irritable, snapping at him over small things. At first, he chalked it up to stress or a rough patch, but the unease lingered. Then there was the other thing. Something he couldn't shake. When they'd returned from their trip, he'd tossed their clothes into the laundry basket and noticed a pair of Candy's panties. Something in the gusset had hardened and emitted a distinctive smell. At first, he didn't understand, but then it hit him like a freight train. The realization left him reeling, his stomach churning as if the ground had been pulled out from under him. Was she cheating? The thought alone felt like a betrayal of their entire relationship. Tim knew he needed answers, and fast. Before heading to the West Coast for work, he visited a family law attorney recommended by a friend who'd recently gone through a painful divorce. Ruby Hawkins, the lawyer, had a reputation for being sharp and empathetic. "Are you sure your wife is cheating?" Ruby asked, her gaze steady and professional as she leaned back in her chair. Tim hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not 100% sure," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I need to know. And if it's true, I need to be prepared for what comes next." Ruby nodded thoughtfully. "All right. Let's start with what you've observed so far. We'll go from there." For Tim, it felt like the beginning of a path he never thought he'd have to walk. But he knew he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. "I want a divorce," Tim said firmly. Ruby Hawkins, the lawyer, nodded with understanding but kept her tone neutral. "Well, most divorces in this state are no fault, meaning neither party needs to prove wrongdoing. However, if you want to file on the grounds of adultery, you'll need strong evidence to support your claim." Tim leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "What kind of evidence are we talking about? Pictures? Videos?" Ruby nodded. "Exactly. Proof that's undeniable. If you'd like, I can connect you with a private investigator who can follow her discreetly and gather the evidence you need." "Yes, please," Tim said without hesitation. "Let's do that. What should I expect during the divorce process?" Ruby tapped a pen against her desk, thoughtful. "Given that Candy earns about the same as you from your teaching job, we should be able to avoid any child support obligations, especially since you don't have any kids. You don't own real estate together, so this would likely be a straightforward division of assets, 50-50ths. You'll keep your pension, and she'll keep hers. If we can prove adultery, it might help ensure a more favorable outcome for you." Tim nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "Okay. Let's move forward with that plan. I'll be out of town for 3 days for work, and I think that's when she'll let her guard down." Ruby wasted no time. She called Marvin Johnson, a trusted private investigator, and looped Tim in on the plan. Marvin suggested that Tim install a tracking app on Candy's phone and provided him with a device to record calls from their landline. He also handed over a small audio recorder, advising Tim to hide it discreetly in Candy's purse. Tim hesitated as he took the devices, guilt and unease gnawing at him. "I hate having to do this," he admitted, his voice low. "But I need to know. I understand, Ruby said sympathetically. It's not easy, but the truth will help you move forward, one way or another. As Tim prepared for his trip, other troubling thoughts weighed on his mind. He couldn't ignore how Jake, his boss and camping companion, had been acting recently. Jake's arrogance and smugness seemed dialed up a notch, as though he knew something Tim didn't. The suspicion gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the plan ahead. Finally, the day came. Candy drove him to the airport, her demeanor seemingly normal. As she leaned in to kiss him goodbye, Tim couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was he imagining it all? Or was this kiss just another mask hiding the truth? He took a deep breath, boarded the plane, and steeled himself for what might come next. I'll call you this evening after dinner, Tim told Candy as he grabbed his carry-on bag. Okay, honey, she replied with a warm smile. Have a good flight. The first night away, as promised, Tim called Candy to check in. Her voice was cheerful, but what she said caught him off guard. Oh, by the way, I'm working as a waitress at Jake's party tonight, she said casually. Tim paused, confusion creeping into his voice. Wait, what party? Jake didn't mention anything to me before I left. Yeah, one of the waitresses called in sick, and Jake asked if I could fill in, Candy explained. He's paying me $150 for the night, and I figured it'd be good to earn a little extra since I won't be back to work until classes start in a couple of weeks. Tim forced himself to sound supportive, though unease stirred in his chest. All right, he said slowly. Go ahead, but be careful, and let me know how it goes tomorrow, okay? I will, Candy reassured him. Her tone softened. You know I love you, right? I love you too, Tim replied, though the knot in his stomach tightened. As the call ended, Tim sat staring at his phone, the feeling of dread growing stronger. Something didn't sit right about Candy working at Jake's house, especially without any mention of this party beforehand. Unable to shake his discomfort, Tim picked up the phone again and called Marvin, the investigator. I just wanted to let you know, Tim began, Candy said she's waitressing tonight at a party at Jake Hudson's house. Understood, Marvin replied calmly. I'll make sure we have eyes on the situation and update you with anything we uncover. Thank you, Tim said, ending the call. The next day, Tim tried reaching Candy on her cell phone, but his calls went unanswered. He tried their home line, only to be met with the familiar beep of the answering machine. He told himself there was no way she would have spent the night at Jake's house. She wouldn't do that. But his hopes were dashed when an email from Marvin arrived that afternoon. Candy spent the night at Jake Hudson's house and is still there, Marvin wrote bluntly. She was very busy last night. I've attached a few photos, but I must warn you, they're explicit. Tim's hands trembled as he opened the email. His world felt like it was collapsing around him as he braced himself for the images that might change everything forever. Tim opened the attachments, his breath catching in his throat. His heart felt like it stopped as the images unfolded before him. There was Candy, his wife of 5 years, engaged in acts he could scarcely process, 3 men, not just Jake, but others he once considered friends. The betrayal cut so deeply it felt physical. His hands trembled, and tears streamed down his face. It was like watching the life he had built crumble before his eyes. In a desperate attempt for answers, Tim dialed Candy's cell phone again. It went straight to voicemail. He tried the home line, but once more, only the answering machine responded. His wife, his partner, was unreachable, and her absence was becoming more ominous by the moment. Tim's world felt alien now. The colleagues he once trusted, the man he'd called his boss and mentor, none of it seemed real anymore. Worse still, he didn't recognize the other men in the photos, likely friends of Jake or his son, Mike. Struggling to keep his emotions in check, Tim finished his business with the California client, the contract in hand feeling hollow now. He checked out of his hotel and caught the earliest flight home. As the taxi pulled up to his house, Tim immediately noticed Candy's car was missing. Checking the tracker app Marvin had installed, he confirmed what he feared: her phone was still at Jake's house. Inside his home, Tim felt the suffocating silence of betrayal. He changed into fresh clothes, each action mechanical and deliberate, as if grounding himself in the mundane would make the chaos in his mind more bearable. Then he picked up the phone and called Ruby's office. Meanwhile, at Jake's house, Candy was far from the remorse Tim hoped she might feel. Her thoughts were clouded with rationalizations. She hadn't planned to stay that first night, but lying naked between Jake and his son, Mike, had felt thrilling, indulgent. A small voice told her she deserved this, a moment of selfish pleasure. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, she thought. Her plan was simple: this would all stop when her classes started again. She could go back to being the loving wife, and Tim would never need to know. But that first night turned into another, and another. The boundaries she'd already shattered meant little now. On the second day, Jake went to work for a few hours, leaving Mike to keep Candy occupied. Mike, ever opportunistic, had even arranged for some of his own friends to join. Candy didn't resist. She buried her guilt under layers of justification, telling herself it was temporary. When Jake returned home, he found the scene waiting for him: Candy completely immersed in this new, twisted world they'd created. "What if Tim finds out?" she asked Jake in a fleeting moment of doubt. "Come on, you'll think of something," Jake said with a smirk. "Just tell him you have a headache or something like that. He'll believe it." Candy nodded, letting the fleeting worry dissolve into the haze of the moment. What she didn't know was that Tim already knew everything. And he was coming home, ready to confront the truth she thought she could keep hidden forever. Later that day, Candy's spiral into reckless abandon deepened. Mike invited several of his friends over, turning Jake's house into an unofficial party. Candy, far removed from any guilt, indulged in the attention and continued her affair. To her, it seemed like a strange, liberating escape from her ordinary life. Meanwhile, back home, Tim was stunned by the evidence Marvin had collected. Beyond the explicit photographs, Marvin had provided 2 DVDs containing video footage of Candy's infidelity. Watching even a few moments was devastating. "God only knows what she's picked up from all these men," Tim muttered to himself, his voice tinged with disgust and heartbreak. When he met Ruby, she had practical advice: tell her you're not feeling well. This will give you some time to think and plan your next steps. Tim nodded, still reeling. "All right," he agreed, before leaving Ruby's office. Sitting in his car, he stared at his phone, realizing something critical: he couldn't go back to working for Jake. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it had permeated every corner of his life. The thought of facing Jake and the others, knowing what they'd done, was unbearable. He scrolled through his contacts and dialed John, a longtime friend and mentor. "Hey, John," Tim said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You mentioned dinner at your place soon. I'd love to join and talk about the compensation package you mentioned. But I can't bring my wife." "Tim, what's going on?" John asked, his concern evident. "I don't want to go into detail over the phone, but maybe we can talk tonight," Tim replied. "Of course," John said quickly. "Rose is a licensed counselor, she might be able to help if you're open to it." "That actually sounds like a good idea." "Thanks, John," Tim said, grateful for the support. As he hung up, Tim braced himself for the difficult conversations ahead. Candy, lost in her hedonistic choices, was oblivious to how her actions were tearing their marriage apart. Unbeknownst to her, the truth she thought she could bury had already surfaced, and the fallout was beginning to unfold. When Candy picked Tim up from the airport, her demeanor seemed forced, her words overly cheerful. "So, how was your trip to California?" she asked, her tone light but tinged with unease. "It was successful," Tim replied curtly. His expression was unreadable as he adjusted his seatbelt. Then, after a pause, he added, "How was your little job at Jake's house?" Candy hesitated for a split second, but her answer came quickly. "Oh, everything went fine. Nothing special." Tim wasn't convinced, and his silence spoke volumes. Candy, desperate to steer the conversation away, fidgeted with her hair. Meanwhile, back at Jake's house, the mood was far more relaxed. Jake leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied grin on his face as Candy paced nervously. "What if Tim knows?" Candy fretted aloud. "What if he's planning to leave me?" Jake chuckled, his tone dismissive. "So what if he does? You can always stay with us. Don't worry about Timmy boy, I'll make sure he's too busy to even be around much." Problem solved. "I don't want to lose him," Candy said sharply, her voice shaking. "I love him." Jake's laughter filled the room. "Oh, you've shown us all just how much you love him over the past 2 days, haven't you?" Candy's cheeks flushed. "It's not funny, Jake," she snapped, her voice breaking. Jake just smirked. Later that evening, Tim arrived at John and Rose Carlson's house, bottle of wine in hand. He rang the doorbell, and John greeted him warmly, taking the wine with a smile. "Come in, Tim. Thanks for this, it'll be put to good use tonight." Inside, Rose greeted Tim with her signature lasagna waiting on the dining room table. "Tim, meet my wife, Rose," John said. "Rose, this is Tim Burns, our new customer service representative." Rose smiled kindly and extended her hand. "It's great to meet you, Tim. We're glad to have you on board." "Thank you," Tim said, his tone genuine but subdued. As they ate, the conversation shifted to Tim's personal struggles. "What are you going to do now, other than change jobs?" Rose asked gently. "I've met with a lawyer, and I'm filing for divorce," Tim admitted, his voice steady but heavy. "My lawyer says it'll be an even split, but honestly, that's not what's weighing on me the most." Rose nodded empathetically. "Have you thought about counseling, for yourself?" she asked. Tim shook his head. "This has gone too far. It's like Candy flipped a switch, and suddenly, she became someone I don't recognize. I never thought she'd have it in her to betray me like this. How are you coping with all this?" Rose pressed, her tone soft and concerned. Tim sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Not great. My lawyer says I should stay composed and not let emotions get the better of me, but it's hard. It's really hard." After dinner, John invited Tim to his home office. Pouring each of them a glass of brandy, John reassured Tim that he was making the right decisions and shared advice about starting fresh in his new role. For the first time in days, Tim felt like he was regaining control of his life. By the time he left, it was 10 p.m. As he drove home, he clung to the small sense of clarity and purpose that the evening had given him, preparing himself for the battle still ahead. When Tim arrived home, the house was quiet, the dim light from the kitchen casting a cold glow. He glanced around, noticing Candy's purse left carelessly on the table. His eyes locked onto the audio recorder he had placed inside. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and downloaded the recording from the previous day's phone call. The words were a confirmation of what he already knew, but hearing them was like reopening a fresh wound. Candy's voice, Jake's smug remarks, and the casual betrayal in their tones played on repeat in his mind. Tim didn't say a word to Candy before leaving. He didn't tell her goodbye, didn't say he loved her. She heard the door close and, realizing he was gone, climbed into bed. Tears streaked her cheeks as guilt and regret finally began to settle over her. At the office the next morning, Tim barely acknowledged anyone. He nodded briefly at his secretary before retreating into his office and closing the door behind him. Determined to sever ties, he began packing his personal items, clearing out the remnants of the life he once felt proud of. As he was gathering his things, Jake walked in, his expression a mixture of faux concern and smug confidence. "What's this, Tim?" he asked, gesturing to the half-empty office. "Look, I know this is upsetting, but let's be reasonable. Your wife was more than willing to have sleep with me. We shouldn't let something like this ruin your career. Just go with the flow for a while, let Candy sow some wild oats. When she's done, she'll come back to you. She always will. Tim froze, the sheer audacity of Jake's words igniting a wave of anger. He turned slowly, his voice cold and measured. Do you really think I'd ever agree to something like that? By the way, how long has this been going on? How long have you been having your fun with her? Jake smirked, as if proud of his answer. The first time. At the campsite. On the second day, when you and the others went skiing. And just so you know, she came on to me. She pestered me about it, Tim. If anything, she made it easy. Tim clenched his fists, willing himself to remain composed. He pointed to the photo of Candy on his desk, a reminder of what was now a sham of a marriage. You forgot something, Jake said mockingly, picking up the frame. I haven't forgotten, Tim replied firmly. But I don't want it. You and your son want this traitor so badly. Take her. I'm done, with her, with you, and with this place. Goodbye. Without waiting for a response, Tim walked past Jake, his steps heavy with finality. Jake stood there, stunned, watching Tim leave. Questions swirled in his mind. How did Tim find out? What had gone wrong? Later that day, Candy sat on the sofa, her head in her hands as sobs racked her body. When Jake called to inform her of Tim's resignation, her despair deepened. What do you mean he resigned? She whispered, her voice trembling. But her questions were left unanswered. Minutes later, the sound of Tim's car pulling into the driveway broke the silence. Candy's heart raced as she realized the moment she had dreaded was finally here. Tim pulled into the driveway and immediately scanned for any sign of Jake's car. Seeing only Candy's vehicle, he let out a faint sigh, grabbed his briefcase and the box of belongings from his office, and headed inside. Candy was sitting on the couch, her face puffy from tears, but Tim barely acknowledged her. Without a word, he walked past her and went straight to his home office. He closed and locked the door behind him, shutting out her muffled attempts to speak. Sitting at his desk, Tim methodically checked the audio recorder for any new evidence. Sure enough, there it was, the conversation between Candy and Jake. As he listened to their words, each sentence felt like a nail in the coffin of their marriage. The blatant betrayal, the audacity of their actions, it was all laid bare. When Tim finally emerged from the office, his face was set with a cold determination. Candy looked up at him, her eyes red and pleading. First things first, Tim said flatly. Later today, someone will be coming by to serve you the papers. Candy's jaw dropped, her voice trembling. Papers? Divorce? Why? I don't want a divorce. I love you. Tim's expression didn't falter. I know everything, Candy. About Jake, his son, and all the others you've been having fun with these past few days. I've filed for divorce on the grounds of adultery. Candy recoiled as though struck. Adultery? You don't have any proof, she protested. Tim's response was calm but cutting. He pulled an envelope from his briefcase and placed it on the table. Sliding out a series of time-stamped photographs, he laid them in front of her one by one. Each image was derogatory, capturing her actions with Jake, his son, and others. I think these say otherwise, Tim said icily. Candy's face went pale, and her hands shook as she tried to gather the photos. You wouldn't show these to anyone, she stammered. Tim leaned forward, his voice steady and deliberate. Do you want to test me? Do you think the parents of your students would want someone like you teaching their children? No, she whispered, her voice breaking. You wouldn't dare. Do you want to take that chance? Tim asked. Candy lowered her gaze, her shoulders slumping in defeat. No, she muttered. I need this job. That's what I thought, Tim said, his tone clipped. There's more. You'll need to hand over your rings and give up my last name. Candy gasped, her hand instinctively clutching the wedding band. Oh my God, you've become so cruel. Cruel. Tim said, his voice rising slightly. What about you? Did you ever think about what you were doing, Candy? Did you even stop to think about the consequences? None of your lovers use protection. Weren't you worried about getting pregnant or catching something? I'm still on the pill, she said defensively, though her voice lacked conviction. That doesn't mean you can't get pregnant, Tim countered. And it certainly doesn't mean you're safe from diseases. Is this really what you planned, Candy? Is this the life you wanted? Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head. No, Tim. I didn't mean for this to happen. Tim shook his head in disbelief, the pain of her betrayal still fresh and raw. You know, during all the years we were together, I thought I knew you. I thought we were building a life. Turns out, I didn't know you at all. He turned away, heading toward the door. Behind him, Candy sobbed quietly, her world crumbling as Tim left her with nothing but regret and the wreckage of what once was. Tim stood in the living room, his arms crossed and his face hardened, as Candy frantically packed her belongings. You know, he said coldly, his voice steady, I've been pestered by plenty of women over the years. Women who, compared to you, look like goddesses. Do you know why I refused them all? Because I thought we had something real. I thought I was building a life with someone I could trust. Candy said nothing, her tears falling silently as she shoved clothes and belongings into one trash bag after another. Tim's voice grew sharper. Take everything you care about because whatever you leave behind will either be burned, thrown away, or donated to Goodwill. That includes photographs and your wedding dress. Candy froze for a moment, her hand clutching a bag. Can you at least help me carry this to the car? She asked, her voice trembling. No, Tim replied bluntly. It's your trash, you deal with it. And don't forget, anything left behind will be gone for good. Candy's sobbing grew louder, but she didn't argue. She grabbed the bags and began dragging them to her car. Just then, a knock sounded at the door. Tim turned toward it, his expression unchanging. I think this is for you, he said. Candy hesitated but shuffled to the door. When she opened it, a deputy sheriff stood there, his expression neutral. Candace Burns? He asked. That's me, Candy answered, her voice barely audible. May I see some identification? The deputy asked. Candy retrieved her driver's license and handed it to him. He examined it briefly, then handed it back along with a thick envelope. You've been served, ma'am, he said flatly. Candy stared at the envelope, her hands trembling as she took it. A few days later, Candy's parents, George and Bernice, arrived to collect the remaining items Candy had left behind. Tim greeted them at the door, his demeanor polite but detached. Tim, thank you for letting us come by, George said with a heavy sigh. We'll be quick. Tim nodded but made his boundary clear. Just make sure she's not with you. She has a restraining order against her. George nodded. Understood. While packing up the last of Candy's things, Bernice tried to reason with Tim. Tim, she made a mistake, she pleaded, her voice soft and maternal. You know how much she loves you. Can't you forgive her? You could move past this and take her back. Tim turned to her, his gaze piercing. What exactly did she tell you, Bernice? Did she tell you about Jake? About his son? About the others? Or did she just say it was one mistake? Bernice's face paled, her mouth opening as if to respond, but no words came. Later that evening, Tim was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, when another knock came at the door. He froze, his heart quickening. Peering through the peephole, he saw Jake, Mike, and two of his former colleagues standing on the porch, their expressions smug and self-assured. Without hesitation, Tim walked to his office and opened the gun case. He retrieved the handgun he kept there, tucking it behind his back as he dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator asked. There are 4 men outside my door, Tim said calmly but firmly. I believe they're here to cause trouble. I'm armed and in my home. Please send someone immediately. Tim stood by the door, his hand steady on the weapon hidden behind his back. He was done playing games, ready to defend the little piece he had left. Tim barely had time to react before the 4 men barged into his home, Jake leading the charge with a smug, angry sneer. We're going to teach you a lesson, Jake growled, stepping closer. But Tim was ready. He pulled out the gun he'd hidden behind his back and leveled it at Jake, his hand steady and his face unwavering. Stop right there, Tim said, his voice cold and commanding. The men froze, startled by the sight of the weapon. Jake's bravado didn't fade entirely. You're not really going to shoot us, he said with a smirk. You don't have the guts. Tim's eyes narrowed, his finger resting firmly near the trigger. Try me, he said. Just then, sirens blared outside, and moments later, police officers entered the house, guns drawn. Drop your weapon, one officer shouted. Tim carefully placed the firearm on the floor and stepped back, raising his hands. It's registered, he said calmly. The officers approached cautiously, securing the gun before asking for identification. Tim handed over his driver's license and firearms permit. After verifying his documents, the lead officer returned them with a nod. Now, the officer said, turning to Jake and his men, all of you, turn around and put your hands behind your backs. Reluctantly, Jake and the others complied, glaring at Tim as the officers cuffed them and read them their rights. You'll regret this, Tim, Jake spat as he was led out. Tim said nothing, watching as the men were escorted out of his home. Months later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the judge delivered his verdict. The case had been grueling, but Tim's persistence and the evidence presented left no room for doubt. I find in favor of the plaintiff, the judge declared, his tone stern. Mr. Hudson, your actions were reprehensible. You not only exploited a man who trusted you as a friend, but you also abused your authority as his employer to systematically destroy his marriage and personal life. Additionally, your repeated violations of the restraining order demonstrate a blatant disregard for the law. I hereby order you to pay $1 million in damages to Mr. Burns. Tim sat stoically, his face unreadable as the verdict was read. The courtroom murmured in agreement, many visibly disapproving of Jake's behavior. The fallout was swift and severe for Jake. Word of his actions spread quickly, and his reputation in the business world crumbled. Companies began severing ties, wary of associating with someone who had intentionally destroyed another man's life. Tim quietly observed as Jake's empire began to collapse, convinced that bankruptcy was inevitable within the year. Despite the victory, Tim remained reserved. He refused to entertain the advances of women who expressed interest in him, holding firm to his belief that he was still a married man until the divorce was finalized. One afternoon, Tim drove to Bernice and George's house to finalize some lingering matters. When he arrived, he was shocked to see Candy. She looked frail, her once vibrant demeanor replaced with a tired, thin figure. She approached him cautiously, her eyes filled with regret. Tim, she began, her voice soft and trembling. But Tim raised his hand, stopping her in her tracks. Don't, he said firmly. Candy froze, her shoulders slumping as she stepped back. Saddened, she returned to the sofa and motioned for him to sit. You look good, Tim, she said quietly, her gaze lingering on him. Better than I remember. Tim remained standing, his expression unchanging. What did you expect, Candy? He asked, his voice devoid of emotion. Candy looked away, unable to meet his eyes. The weight of her choices bore down on her, but Tim had already moved past her, focused on the life he was rebuilding from the ashes of their broken marriage. Tim sat across from Candy, her frail figure slumped in the chair. Her eyes were weary, but there was a glimmer of vulnerability he hadn't seen in years. How are things going with you? She asked softly. Okay, Tim said, nodding. New job, new friends, new outlook on life. How about you, Candy? She looked down at her hands, her voice trembling. Not good at all. You know I'm HIV positive, right? Tim stiffened but kept his tone neutral. Yes, your mother mentioned it. I'm sorry to hear that. He paused, searching for the right words. But to be honest, Candy, this is the first time you've really taken responsibility for what you did. The first time you've acknowledged what your actions caused, not just to me but to yourself. Candy's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time, Tim saw the weight of regret etched across her face. I've thought about everything, Tim, she said quietly. If I had just told Jake to leave me alone that first day at the campsite, maybe we'd still be together. Tim sighed deeply. It's possible, he admitted. But I have a feeling it would have happened sooner or later. He's been after you for a long time. You just couldn't see it. Candy nodded, her head drooping. You're probably right, she whispered. But it doesn't make it any easier to live with. Tim thought of Rose's counseling sessions, the wisdom she had shared. Holding on to hate wouldn't help him move forward. Candy had destroyed their marriage, but forgiveness was for his peace, not hers. He nodded slowly. Okay, Candy. I forgive you. Her tears flowed freely as she looked at him. Thank you, Tim, she whispered, her voice breaking. This means more to me than you'll ever know. Tim stood briefly, considering pulling her into an embrace, but Candy waved him off weakly. I'm really tired, she said. I need to rest now. But thank you for coming. It means a lot. You're welcome, Candy, Tim said, turning toward the door. And remember, call me if you just want to talk. She nodded, her head barely lifting. I will. Days later, Tim's world was rocked by a horrifying news report. A triple homicide had occurred, involving Jake, his son, and a third victim. When Tim read the details, his heart sank, and he immediately called Bernice. Her voice was choked with sobs when she answered. Tim, she cried, we just got word. Candy is dead. What? Tim's breath caught in his throat. What happened? It was Jake, Bernice sobbed. He shot her. Then his own son. And then himself. Tim closed his eyes, the weight of the news crushing him. Oh my God, he whispered. I saw the news report, but I prayed it wasn't her. It's her, Bernice confirmed through her tears. She didn't deserve this, Tim. No one does. I'm so sorry, Bernice, Tim said, his voice filled with sorrow. As the details emerged, the tragedy became even darker. Jake, consumed by his own bitterness and rage, had taken everything from Candy in one final act of violence. Tim spent several days mourning Candy's death, reflecting on the good years they had shared before it all fell apart. Though she had made terrible mistakes, there had been a time when their love was real and pure. One day, while Tim was at work, a colleague stopped by his desk. Cynthia Stone, another representative on his team, gave him a warm smile. Hello, cowboy, she said, her tone light and playful. Would you like to join us for happy hour tonight? You look like you could use some company. Tim hesitated, caught off guard. He almost refused out of habit but stopped himself. Life was short, and perhaps it was time to let a little light back in. What the hell, he said with a small smile. I could use a drink. As Cynthia beamed and walked away, Tim felt a flicker of hope. The pain of the past wouldn't disappear overnight, but maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for him after all.